Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm Ori. I'm your host for this fireside chat. And I'm here today with Spencer Greenberg, who is the founder of Sparkwave, an amazing startup foundry. He's the founder of clearerthinking.org, which has tools to help you think rationally, and the founder of the Clearer Thinking podcast, which is an amazing place to hear interesting conversations with great thinkers. Thanks so much for being here, Spencer.
Thanks for having me. Really glad to be here.
So I'm going to, ask some things I've been intrigued about with Spencer in the next 40 minutes. We're also looking for questions from you. So if you are in Swapcard, I am posting the link to the session right now in the chat. And if you can leave your questions and thoughts, I'll try to get through as many as I can. We also have some polls in the poll tab. We've got one right now, which is intriguing already. So if you haven't voted, we'd love to hear what you think. Spencer, let me start.
Can you hold on a second, Ori? I'm getting a weird echo effect. Are you hearing it?
I am not. Paul, how are we doing?
There we go. Fixed it. Thank you. Okay, now
Phenomenal.
I can hear you. Awesome.
Fantastic. Well, Spencer, let me start you with this one. So I think often good decision making rests on prioritization and balance. There are some things which are good to do up to a point, but which can become negative if you take them too far. Are there any cognitive tools or strategies that you think you took too far and then have since had to move back with?
Yeah, I think that a very common thing for sort of analytical type people is that they overinvest in minor decisions or decisions where there's not that much extra value in considering thinking about it for longer. And so one rule of thumb I like to try to apply is considering, okay, in the last hour that I spent on this decision, did I actually make any progress? Like, am I actually more confident than I was before? And if not, that might be an indicator that like, okay, I'm actually, even if it's an important decision, maybe it's not worth investing more in this. Now, of course, it could be the case that there's some other type of research or investigation you should do that will yield fruit and help you make the decision. But I think a lot of times, if you spend another hour or two and you're just not more confident than you were before, it might be time to stop analyzing and just go with your best guess at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you think there are things that this audience specifically might be prone to overweight in their decisions overall?
Well, one thing that I think tends to be true in the effective altruism community is that there's this idea that goes around that you're supposed to make decisions numerically. Like I've had people who've asked me, well, how do I do the calculation to figure out the expected utility of my project I'm working on? And my answer is usually like, you can't. There's no way you can do that. I think, unfortunately, a lot of things in life are in the realm where we can't do a calculation. We could try. We could plug numbers into a tool like Estimate. And in some cases, maybe that will help. But I think there are many things where even that is actually not going to help you very much. And if you do assign numbers, you're going to be making up so many of the numbers and they're going to be so uncertain that you're often better off with the type of decision making that really says, let's cut this down to the core factors. If I had to say, what are the 3 to 5 things that are driving this, and just focus on those and try to really understand those and sort of neglect the other terms that I know are not going to have a large impact. And have a model of the situation I can keep in my mind and I can think about. I think that actually often will outperform trying to sort of over quantify, write down 30 variables where you're just making up numbers for each of them.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And that's definitely a trajectory I've been on myself from first learning about quantification and finding a lot of value in it to realizing I had gone too far. It seems very relevant as a segue to now go to the poll that we launched earlier. For anyone who hasn't seen it, the poll asks, what % of people attending this fireside chat do you think you're more rational than? And Spencer, maybe you could comment on the results that we're seeing there.
Well, I think some more people should vote. It's only 21 votes so far. But the results so far are intriguing. Maybe we should come back to it.
Okay, let's come back to this. If you have not yet voted in the poll and you are in Swapcard, please go to the poll tab and give that a vote. Okay, Spencer, another question from me. You've spoken in the past about feeling like you're only doing or achieving about 1% of what you could be. But to me, you don't sound morose when you say this. You sound quite practical. And I think a lot of us struggle with this idea of are we doing what we could be doing? But sometimes, people who feel like they're not doing enough feel very sad about it. Other people, I think, feel like they're doing everything they could be doing, but, perhaps that is not necessarily the case. Like perhaps there's like some misestimates there as well. So I wondered if you could talk us through like how you think about this and why you're not more morose about this idea.
Yeah, I would say that I'm very much an optimizer. Like it's just very fundamental to my personality. Like something is not as good as it could be, try to make it better. But I tend to view optimization very optimistically. Like I get excited about the potential of things. Whereas you could imagine being an optimizer in the reverse way, where you constantly obsess about how you're not good enough, or how things could be better, or you didn't do well enough, you didn't do as well as you could. And I think there it's really a question of framing. And I think it's important to distinguish between telling yourself lies, which I really don't advocate, and picking the framing that is most helpful to you. Because often framings are neither true nor false. They're just about what you focus on, right? So it's neither true nor false to focus on all the potential that, like, all the ways you could improve and get excited about that, rather than all the ways you're falling short and feel bad about that, right? That's just like an arbitrary framing thing. So what I try to do is I try to focus on true information, but then find a framing for it that's like as useful to me as possible. And I think an optimistic framing of like, wow, I could be like so much better. That's awesome. Like, let me invest in that and like feel excited about the future of myself being better than I am today. Like, I find that really helpful.
That sounds super helpful. Do you think this is something that you were just born with? Like, do you think that like our emotional valence towards these kind of situations is innate, or is it something that you can learn or hone over time?
Yeah, there's definitely some just personality element. But I think it also depends on where your thoughts go, right? There's I think something that could benefit people a lot that they don't do very often is just like trying to pay close attention to their thought patterns. We don't remember most of our thoughts, like almost all of them we forget. So even trying to like think about, well, what were my thoughts like yesterday is very hard to do. You kind of have to observe them in the moment, like, and pay extra close attention, because they just kind of flip by. And I've done this a few times where you just sort of write down all your let's say, for example, write down all your negative thoughts that you notice for 2 weeks. Like, it's a really interesting exercise. And obviously you'll miss most of them, but you can write down some of them and you kind of learn things about yourself. But I think one thing to observe is that if you're having a thought pattern like, oh man, I could have done this, I could be better in this way, like what a moron I am. That's very different than the thought pattern. I could be better in this way. Oh man, how do I get to that point? That, sort of like in the momentary thought patterns, you can see the difference between sort of optimism and pessimism and self, berating versus, feeling excited about your potential.
That's great. I was about to say, I feel like I'm not very good at doing that, but I've realized that I should say instead, isn't it great that I have the opportunity to get better at doing that? So thank you. You're already changing. You're already helping me think more clearly. Okay. Thanks to everyone who's posting questions in the chat. I'll come to those in a minute. But first, one more question from me. Spencer, I think people are generally attracted to decisiveness. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think decisiveness is such an attractive trait?
Well, I think it's attractive in leaders. I don't know if to some extent, it's probably broadly attractive, but I think it's especially attractive in leaders. And I think when people have a leader, they want to feel like the leader has a plan. Like the leader is leading, the leader is taking them somewhere. And I think when a leader seems indecisive, it can make it feel like the leader has no plan, which makes it seem like you don't have a leader. And that can be very upsetting. And then that can kind of propagate a sense of uncertainty and fear throughout the group. So if you're a leader, I think it's important to communicate in a decisive way. That doesn't mean that you actually make decisions quickly, right? Like maybe you spent, 10 days making the decision really carefully, but then when you go communicate that decision, you want to communicate it in a decisive way. Like, I have a clear plan. This is what we're going to do. You don't have to say, oh, it's definitely going to work 100%, but you could say, here's why I think this is a really good plan. And if something crops up that we didn't expect, we're going to react and we'll reorient. So yeah, I think that's a lot of where it comes from. And in general, I think people find confidence attractive, and decisiveness is also linked to confidence. I think people tend, unfortunately, to project how good they think you are, in part from how good you seem to think you are, right? So it's like, oh, well, Uri thinks he's not that good, so I'm going to think he's not that good. Or Uri thinks he's really great, so I'm going to think he's pretty great, which is a little bit silly, right? Because, well, people project all kinds of things about themselves, but like, I think people tend to over update on, what people project about their view on themselves.
Yeah, I find this one fascinating because even knowing that it is true, I still, when I meet someone confident, my first instinct is to think, wow, like you must be really great. You must be really smart. You sound very confident. And even after years of experiences of this not being very well correlated, with competence in practice, I still instinctively have that moment. Do you think that people who are not feeling super confident, do you have any tricks or ideas? Tricks sounds bad, but how to fake it till you make it, or how to like project confidence even in situations where you might feel anxious.
Yeah, one thing that I found really helpful when I work, so I tend to just seem confident all the time, pretty much. That's just like a personality thing. Even when I'm not confident, I just sound confident, and I'm like, no, really, I have no idea what I'm talking about. And people are like, oh, so you know what you're talking about? No, it's like I have to really emphasize that I don't know what I'm talking about, because people assume that like I just seem confident when I talk. But one thing I found helpful in helping people who are less naturally confident is saying, okay, reword the statement you're going to make to a wording that you're extremely confident in. And so let me give you an example. Suppose someone's like, they're pitching their startup and they're like, we're going to be the next, Tesla or whatever, right? Well, yeah, maybe they can't be confident in that. Maybe that's really hard to actually believe, right? But maybe they can reword that slightly, saying, we're going to pursue this huge opportunity, and here's why I'm really excited to pursue it, right? And like that can actually come across like also very impressive and confident. Although really, if you actually analyze the words, all they're saying is they're going to pursue this opportunity and why they're excited to pursue it, right? And yet it could seem just as confident as this really bold, ambitious claim. So just like tweak the wording to something that you fully believe, and then state it with that full level of belief behind it.
That is really interesting. On a related, but I think slightly different note, like what would you recommend for people who struggle to make decisions in a situation where there's uncertainty, they get stuck on, 3 or 4 options and can't, or 1 or 2 options and can't decide between them? Do you have tips for how to solve that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different types of scenarios here. There's one scenario that comes up is like a good thing versus a good thing, right? It's like 2 great things, and it's like, how do I choose? And I think if the key insight is if you're stuck on choosing between 2 really good things, probably like flipping a coin is like about as good as getting the right one. And I think that's just like something we need to remind ourselves, like, oh, I'm really torn. I've done a ton of research. I'm still stuck on choosing between these 2 good things. I'm going to get a good thing no matter what. So, like flipping a coin is probably actually like even a fine strategy. It doesn't mean you have to flip a coin, but like it's just useful to remind yourself of that. And then when you have like a bad thing versus a good thing, that's like the easy choice scenario. Like you just can, clearly choose the good thing. The other tough scenario is when it's a bad thing versus a bad thing. And there, I think just a useful like sort of a little mental maneuver you can do is related to what Eliezer Yudkowsky talks about with like leave a line of retreat. He's talking about it like in your belief system, like have a way out of your belief system so that you can actually begin to believe something different, because you know what's going to happen if you believe something different. So this is sort of related to that concept, but it's slightly tweaked, which is to say there's 2 really bad things. I'm trying to choose between them. It's a tough choice, or it's a really bad choice. But what I can do is I can start to imagine the world in each of the 2 scenarios and start to imagine getting past it and how I'll rebuild from it, right? Like, maybe the scenario is you break up with your partner who you love, or you leave your job that you love, right? That is a really, that's a heartbreaking scenario. It's really tough. But it's like, imagine the 2 worlds, one where you don't have your partner and one where you don't have your job, and imagine rebuilding. And like, what would that look like? What would that look like in 1 year, and 5 years, and 10 years? And then once you've kind of like mapped out, oh yeah, like I'm not going to literally die. Like there is a world there and I can kind of visualize it. It can make those decisions a lot easier because you kind of can see past that decision. Whereas this weird thing happens when we have like something that's going to like shake our world up so much, it can be hard to see past it. And then that can be terrifying. Just have like no idea of what the world is once that thing is gone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think now might be a good time for us to jump back to the poll tab. So if everyone who is on Swapcard could come to the poll. And before we began the session, we launched this poll question: what % of the people attending this fireside chat do you think you're more rational than? We've now had 62 votes. Spencer, what do you think of these results?
And they're kind of hilarious. Not a single person said 95th percentile or 90th percentile. Yet 11% said 5th percentile. Clearly it's way down skewed, right? Like there's no way really to make sense of this other than to say that people are underestimating their rationality relative to the group. And I'm wondering what's going on there. What do you think?
Yeah, it is fascinating, right? Because, we hear a lot about these cases where everyone thinks they're above average. But here we have a scenario where 100% of people think that they're in the bottom, 75%. And that is kind of fascinating. What do you think emotionally?
We've actually done some research on cases where people are underconfident versus overconfident. And like we tested 100 different skills and asked people basically what percentile they thought they would be in, and tried to look at like what are the factors that make them more overconfident, underconfident. And a few of the things that came up, generally when people think something's easy, they're more likely to rate themselves better than other people. So like lifting a 10-pound weight. When they think something's really difficult, like, I don't know, lifting a 200-pound weight, they tend to do the reverse, put themselves worse than other people. Another one is that when people think something relates to their personality or character, they tend to rate themselves as better than other people in the group. Whereas if it tends to be not related to your personality character, like more like an objective fact that's just sort of, tangential to who someone is, they rate themselves as worse. And then a third one has to do with subjectiveness. When things tend to be subjective, people tend to rate themselves as better than others, whereas if they're very objective, they tend to rate themselves worse. So interestingly, I would from that predict actually people would overestimate the rationality. And I suspect that if you looked at the broad population, people would actually put themselves as better than 50% more often than not. And so I wonder if there's a funny effect going on here where people are like, oh no, I'm in an EA thing and all these people are coming to this talk about rationality. Maybe they're more into rationality than I am, or something like that. I suspect this is very unique to this group.
I think so too. I want to say, firstly, I misspoke earlier. I said that 100% of people had said they were below 75%, when really they had just said they were below 90%. And in fact, someone has since voted that they are in the top 5 percentile. So thank you to whoever updated according to the conversation. If you want to put in chat any thoughts you have about that poll, about how you felt answering the poll, why you answered the way you did, I would be fascinated to hear more from people. We're actually going to do another poll, so please stay in the polling section. And this one is a slightly weird social experiment. So we have a question from Jacob Bauer, which is, how should academics, educators utilize their summers? And what I am doing is publishing a poll where I'm asking you to predict what answer Spencer will give. So I realize these aren't, covering all possible answers, but here are like 4 potential multiple choice selections for what Spencer might say. And I want to see how good people's model of Spencer is so far. So if you can see that poll, if you could take your vote, and then we will see what real life Spencer does say. Did I set up this poll correctly?
I think it's there. Yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I think it's a checkbox. You can choose more than one option.
Oh, okay. I think that's tolerable.
Maybe that's fine.
If anyone, yeah. But it is not showing the results publicly this time. That is interesting. Okay, so we've had a few votes come in. I will just read out the results when we've had a few more. Let me ask you another question in the meantime. So if people want to vote on that, please do. Oh, no, actually, we've already had a lot of votes. Okay, let me stick with this because we're already here. So the question was, how should academics, educators utilize their summers? Thank you, Jacob. The options I gave that Spencer might say are work on a side project, just take a break, do deep work, or same as during the regular year. And so far, we've had 30% of people said Spencer would say work on side projects, 35% said just take a break, 24% said do deep work, and 12% said same as during the regular year. So, Spencer, what do you think academics and educators should do with their summers?
Well, first of all, I want to say, obviously, it depends on the person, depends on the scenario. But because I have to give an answer, I'm going to say work on side projects. My reasoning is mainly because a lot of academics I talk to, I think, feel a little bit constrained. Like they feel like they really want to do something that's like important and matters, but they feel like all these pressures that are bearing down on them, that kind of push them in different directions. And maybe they feel like their work isn't as meaningful as they hoped it would be when they got into it. And so, I think working on side projects could be a way to kind of explore that thing that like you actually think is really important. But also could be a way to explore maybe other things that like, okay, maybe academia is not actually the right trajectory for you. You could explore other things and consider other possibilities there. So, but I don't feel super confident.
How seriously did you consider academia yourself? Were you ever close to becoming a professor?
I never considered it, no.
You did do a PhD.
I did do a PhD. Yeah, but that was just for giggles, you know. No, just because I wanted to learn math and computer science and machine learning really, really well. And yeah, I mean, a PhD is the works to get the job done. It's maybe the slowest possible way to do so, but it gets the job done. I wouldn't necessarily say I made a good decision, but you know, I learned a lot.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think there's this really interesting phenomenon where, like, for a lot of us, because we go to undergrad, academia is like the first, you know, like adult thing that we do. And so like everyone has exposure to it, or like everyone who's been to university has exposure to like professors, whereas like you might not have exposure to entrepreneurs or lawyers or doctors, or, you know, that depends on like where you've been in your life before then. And I do wonder whether part of the reason that a lot of people end up at least considering academia is just, you know, mere exposure, as it were. What do you think about that?
It's almost like the places where we get educated are feeder programs into it. I mean, it's literally, you know, it's kind of funny. It's like, imagine that, like, you know, everyone went to medical school and that's how you got educated. And it's like, oh, wow, there are a lot of doctors, right? It's like, you know, it's like you're literally in an academic system being taught by academics, like, and then it's like, yeah, I think it's naturally a lot of people are going to be drawn to that, either because they model, you know, they look up to their professors and they model it, or the professors tell them good things about it. You know, a lot of kind of different factors like that.
Yeah.
Why would you say with that also? I think one of the biggest mistakes people make career-wise is they don't really understand like the day-to-day experience of doing different careers. So like, this is one of the things I just definitely advocate for someone like earlier in their career. If like you're thinking about doing a thing, you're thinking about even being an academic, but especially for other fields, like, you know, going to medicine or law or whatever, like talk to a bunch of people in that field and be like, well, what is your day actually like? Like, walk me through a day in the life. What are the parts of it you like the best? What are the parts you find frustrating? You know, what are the different, you know, incentives you have and pressures you feel? And then even as important or more important, talk to some people that used to be on the left. And like, that's a perspective that people often don't get, like former academics, former lawyers, former doctors. And I think people just make much better career decisions if they have these conversations.
I love both halves of that. I think the selection effect is incredible. So like if you're in a university, then the professors you meet are all people who successfully became professors. And you really do want to track down the like 9 out of 10 grad students who went to grad school and didn't get a professorship. But I also think the comment about kind of the day-to-day of different experiences just seems really important. I think often when I imagine switching careers, I'm imagining kind of the high-level glamour side, but not really like, do I want to sit down for X hours a day and do this particular activity, which is really the choice you're making.
Right. And that we all see these like TV depictions of jobs that are like extremely unrealistic to the real jobs. Like I remember one of my family members went to biology for a while. And I was just like shocked to learn how much time he spent like pipetting liquids into beakers and stuff like that. I was like, wow, yeah, I guess that makes sense. But like, I thought of it as like doing science when it's actually like a lot of like literally moving fluids and stuff like this, right? I mean, obviously it depends on the type of bio, but yeah, it's like you can have these big surprises.
That is actually like, as a quick side question, I think a lot of the time I find that people who are doing very like high level intelligent conceptual work are also doing literal or metaphorical pipetting, you know, like they're doing the very basic like kind of technician level of the work as well. How do you think about that, like when it makes sense to be doing that stuff yourself versus when you want to be getting, you know, sharing that with someone else?
Well, I mean, there's a kind of basic work that is important to do yourself because the cost can be really high of getting it wrong. Like certain coding things are like this, like, right. Like if someone's like, let's say someone is doing scientific research and they have to analyze their data or something like this, there might be aspects of which that they could outsource. And like, that might be a fine thing to do at times, but there might be a way in which like, if they're not interacting with the code that's like just doing statistical analysis, like they might miss something really important, or there might be some assumption being made that they don't realize, or you know, something. So just being like close to that, the like details of the procedure, I think can be pretty valuable at times. There's also just like a speed thing where it's just like sometimes you want to be able to just like jump right into getting the next piece done, so then you can get back to the main body of the work rather than like, okay, I'm going to pass this off to someone else who's going to give it back to me in a day, right? Like that completely breaks the workflow.
I think something else I struggle with is there are lots of tasks where I feel like trying to explain what I need to someone else can take me longer than doing it myself. But I always have mixed feelings when I do that. I end up, you know, doing kind of formatting or layout work or you know, kind of things that are not particularly my specialty, but where I feel like trying to explain which bits need to go where is a struggle for me. Do you experience that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a major struggle for anyone who's trying to outsource their work, is that they're like, if you actually want to outsource effectively, you kind of have to go through your day and like think about all the different things you do. And then they generally fall into a few different buckets. One bucket is like, oh, I really have to do it. Like, I just can't outsource this. Another bucket is I can outsource this, but only if I sort of train the person first. And then that's fine. You can do that, but it's like an investment. You need like a person who's going to be, permanent or semi-permanent that you can outsource to. You're going to have to give them teach them how to do it, and then give them feedback the first few times they do it until they build up your confidence. And then the third type are things that like many people could do with like little or no training. And then those are like the easiest to outsource by far. But I think that a lot of people, like, there aren't as many of those things as you might think, right? Like a lot of work might fall into the first or second category as well. And so you probably can't outsource 90% of what you do, most likely.
Yeah, I feel that I think this ties back into our very first question, which was about, things that are very useful, but then can be taken too far. And I feel like I have gone on that journey with outsourcing things as well. Luca Petrolati has asked a very relevant question in the chat to jump off from here, which is, how should you distribute time between evaluating options and exploring option space? So how do you, trade off between choosing and pursuing, analyzing a decision versus making it?
So my opinion is that people tend to underinvest like in the pre-project phase. So they don't spend enough time thinking about what is their startup idea they should be working on, or what is the career path they should do, or what projects should they pursue. I think EAs tend to be a bit better, where they tend to invest more, but I think a lot of people underinvest in that like pre-project phase. I think that once you're like in a project, I think it's very useful to say, I'm going to do this for like 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is, and just get your head down and just do your best at it. And like, obviously, if it's not going well, you're miserable, like you can reconsider. But I think there really is a lot of value in being like, I'm going to see this to the end, or I'm going to see this until 2 years at least, or whatever, and just do your best at it, and then go back into an evaluative phase. I think a mistake I see EAs make sometimes is that they're never want to leave the evaluative phase, because they're like, well, what if there's something even better I could do? And the problem with that is that if you actually run that algorithm, you like never do anything, because there's always something better. There's always some new thing you've heard of. There's always some new consideration. Well, maybe this isn't the best thing. And then you end up like bouncing around things, not accomplishing anything, not succeeding, flaking out on the projects you committed to, et cetera. So I recommend a sort of going back and forth, doing deep evaluation, but then sticking to something for at least a while, unless it really sucks. Obviously, if it really sucks, that's another thing. But and then going back into evaluation mode.
Maybe to dig in on that a little more. So if you commit to a project, you do the pre-project evaluation, you think this could be a good project, and then you start the project. And let's say 6 months or a year in, it's not depressing, it's not miserable, it's not horrible for you to do, but it's just getting no traction. No one else seems to be that interested. Is that a situation where you would reevaluate doing the project, or would you change how you do the project, or how would you think about that?
It really depends on what it is and how important it is to you. If you are talking about, like, let's say doing a startup, and you spent 6 months and you have like strong evidence that like this is not something anyone wants, that is a good indicator that you should be adjusting your plan, right? So like there's this idea in startups that you need to be incredibly gritty. You need to like just fight and fight and fight and not give up. If you give up, you automatically lose. And so it's really important to be gritty, but you also don't want to be stubborn. You have to like really pay attention to the evidence and be like adjusting your plans all the time. So it's like adjusting your plans all the time, but sticking with this like long-term trajectory, sticking with this long-term goal for a long time. So if after 6 months, you're just going to throw in the towel, then you're probably not the right material for a startup founder, right? Like that is probably not enough to like make it work. On the other hand, if after 6 months of like the market giving you a really clear signal that nobody wants what you're doing, if you still try to do exactly the same thing, you're also probably not the right person to be a startup founder. You need to be like adjusting based on the evidence, right?
Do you think that what makes sense for the individual person in this situation is different from what makes sense on a societal level? That like on a societal level, it might be that we want a bunch of people to commit to a bunch of endeavors and just see them through to the end, regardless of what happens. That is a very loaded question, but I truly, open question.
I have this phrase that I like to use, which is what's good for the hive is not always good for the bee.
Nice.
And like, Daniel Kahneman talks about how maybe people's irrational overconfidence is like helpful because like people try really hard things that like they're probably going to fail at, and like on expectation, if they have a 90% chance of failing, like maybe that's actually not in there good for them. but it's good like for society because 10% of the time that produces something new. And there's probably something to that. That being said, when you think about your own life, you should be thinking about what can you do, right? Like what's the best choice for you, and not thinking about sort of what, from the hive perspective, like what you want to happen. So yeah, I definitely think you're better off thinking on the margin. With regard to these kinds of decisions, I'm not talking about ethical decisions. I think there's some argument to be made that like certain types of ethical decisions, that it's good to not defect in collective action problems, even if there's going to defect in some things like this. But it's complicated.
I appreciate that. Well, jumping off from here, we have a question from Artem in the audience. Thank you, Artem. Which is, how do you develop a habit of assessing your own decisions and forecasts? Are there tools you use or handy methods that help you, reflect on the decisions you've made and assess whether they went well or not?
Yeah, so I use Prediction Book, which lets me track my predictions. So I tend to use them about things in my life, like big things happening, things I'm interested in, things, projects, things like that. I'll log a prediction in Prediction Book, and then you set a date, and it will remind you. So you put in a probability, it reminds you when the thing happens in the future, and then you can say how well you did, whether you got it right or not. And so I find that really useful. I also tend to predict. I do a lot of Twitter polls, and I like to try to predict pretty much all of my Twitter polls, what I think is going to happen, because I want to build a implicit mental model of human psychology, so I can like predict true things about humans. Of course, my Twitter audience is not like all of humans, but I do try to do corrections in my mind for like the demographics. I do understand the demographics of my Twitter followers pretty well, so I find that really useful as well. Although it's kind of weird, unusual thing that I do there. But for me, it's really important to try to understand humans. And so like being able to predict them is a part of understanding. Other tools we made, if you've never checked out our website, clearthinking.org, check it out. We have a bunch of stuff related to rationality, but also to prediction. So we have a tool called the Calibrate Your Judgment tool that we made with Open Philanthropy. And it lets you practice probabilistic predictions. We have like thousands of questions in there. You can practice making prediction intervals. You can practice predicting probabilities and so on.
Thank you, Spencer. I am posting all these things in the live chat now. Apologies to everyone that I'm just posting naked links, but multitasking is tricky. So we also have a question from Nicholas, which is, again, related. How do you personally integrate designated clearer thinking or contemplation sessions in your daily life? And I'm curious if you do kind of break out specific times in the day to think clearly, or whether it's something that you weave through the whole day.
I guess the way I think about it is a little bit like building a habit. When you're building a habit, you first need to know how to do the thing. And so it's like worth at the very beginning, sort of maybe practicing something explicitly. But then you just have to like try to use the thing in the real world scenarios. Like doing clear thinking well can't be done at like just 10 minutes a day, right? Like, yes, you could have 10 minutes for reflection, that might be useful, but like to do clear thinking well, you have to like actually integrate it in the real life, like as information's coming in, as you're making real life decisions and so on. So that's what I aspire to do, is to sort of integrate it into the decisions I'm making. And I try to do that in a bunch of ways. Interpersonally, I try to have a heuristic of like trying to make sure that I really understand what another person's telling me, especially if they disagree. I try to apply a heuristic of adopting their perspective and saying, well, even if it doesn't sound reasonable or right to me, like this is a reasonable person. And so like if I can't see how it seems reasonable, then I'm like missing something about their frame, and let me try to get into that frame. So I can, like, even if I think they're wrong, like I can at least understand the perspective from which what they're saying is reasonable. So those are a couple like interpersonal ones I use. With decision making, I aspire to like not get stuck in binary choices when it's unnecessary. Like I think often there are more options than we consider, and so like we feel stuck on like should do A or B, but maybe there's a C and D, and so I try to generate more options. So there's a lot of like little micro ways throughout my day that I try to incorporate this stuff. Obviously, I fail most of the time, but I also think I'm much better than I used to be. So I think there's progress, which is exciting.
That's great. That's a great thing to feel. So we still have 10 minutes left on our session. If people do have questions, please do post them in the chat. And there is actually an upvote options on the question. So if you see a question someone else has posted that you especially want to hear the answer to, please do vote on it so that it will bubble to the top. I'm reposting the link to the questions in the Zoom as well. So we have a highly upvoted question from Dave Courtwright. Thank you, Dave, which is, how do you factor emotions and feelings into your rational thinking? I know that's a big question, but if you have thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, I feel like there's this really common failure mode when people first get into rationality stuff of like thinking that emotions are bad or something, or like the way to be rational is to like not have emotions. I think this is just like horribly wrong. Here's a perspective that I think is much more accurate. Your emotions are each detectors for a type of thing. So anxiety/fear, it's a detector for danger. Sadness is a detector for loss. Anger is a detector for someone trying to block or interfere with your goals or harm what you value. Like, I mean, oversimplifying a little bit, obviously, these are more complex than this. But if we just had to give them really simple descriptions as detectors, and then when you start to think about it this way, you're like, wow, I have all of these cool detectors that are built into my brain architecture. It would be insane not to leverage these, right? Like, so you should use the detectors as much like you use your sight and your hearing and your, et cetera, right? You have all these sensory organs, and your emotions are kind of like a sensory organ in a way. Although they're sensing, they're in practice, they're combining all the senses, right? Like anxiety is combining sound and sight, et cetera, but it's combining into sort of a signal. So I try to think of it as like, wow, all my emotions are really useful. Let me try to understand how they work, and then let me try to wield them as tools the way I would wield any tool to help me make better decisions. I think also, this is not quite emotions, but there are other things I wouldn't quite call emotions that our brains do that are very, very important. And I think one of those I think about is our brain kind of tells us what we value. Like, we can think about a state in the world and I'll be like, that one's valuable. Like, okay, people being happy, that's valuable. Like, people in pain, that's bad. That's disvaluable. A bunch of pebbles lying in a pile. Okay, that's neutral, right? And like, it's like, well, what do you do? What are your goals? What are you optimizing for? Like, at some level, you have to like tap into your introspection and sort of perceive what you actually value. Now, I mean, that's not the only way to live, but that's, I think, a useful tool that your brain gives you. It's not quite an emotion, but it's sort of emotion-like. It's the ability to kind of perceive, according to your brain, what's valuable and what's not.
This is great. This is a really helpful perspective shift, I think. And yeah, I'm looking forward to incorporating it. We have a top voted question from Matthew, which is, you've mentioned on your podcast that you host parties with explicit communication rules or interesting formats. And the question is, what kind of format or rule have you found especially fun? Are there any that come to mind?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't heard about this before, I run a group in New York called Ergo. It's a social experiment group. And what we do is we throw social experiments, but we have a rule where we're never allowed to use the same format more than once, which forces us to do weirder and like more surprising stuff as we run out of ideas. So it's sort of intentional. Uri, maybe you can think about Uri's been to some, so maybe you can think about what your favorite one was. But one that really I thought was fascinating that we did was we assigned people a social status when they arrived, and they had to wear it on their lapel as a number. So like everyone could see other people's numbers, including their own. So if, like, let's say you were assigned a 10 and I was assigned a 1, I would have to act like you're the most important person on earth, and you'd have to act like I'm the least important person on earth. And then people got to rotate throughout the night. So it was like a cocktail party, but with these like enforced social statuses that everyone was wearing. And then halfway through the party, I gave a little presentation on ways to signal status, because like for the first half, I wanted people just to try to signal low and high status. But then after I wanted them to have like specific ideas, specific things you could do to try to signal high and low status. And yeah, I think it was really interesting. One of the things that I found especially fascinating was like how strong people's reactions were to it. So like one woman who just almost always projects low social status, like her mind was blown by doing this, because like the way people acted towards her was so different than her normal experience that she was just like shocked by it. And then this guy who projects high social status, he came up to me after and complained that he's like, this is impossible. There's no way you can adjust your social status. It's not possible to do that. It was just interesting because it's just like, he's just on this high social status thing all the time. And just like, he doesn't realize even that he's doing it. It's just sort of like so ingrained in him. So I thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah, that is really, it's just the water we swim in. I feel like I should try going out in the city and pretending to be a different social status and seeing how people react to me differently. Do you do live experiments in the world like that sometimes?
Not so much,
Um,
but maybe I should. But yeah, what's funny, because social status is very like situation dependent, right? Like, imagine someone who's normally low social status, but everyone came to see their show and they just put on a great performance. Like they're going to at least temporarily have really high social status, and maybe it will raise theirs in general. But like, in that context, or like someone who's normally low social status, but is like the best chess player, when you're playing chess, they suddenly their status is raised. So there's a lot of like interesting contextual things around that.
Amazing. So we unfortunately only have time for a couple more questions, but let's hear your thoughts on these topics. Some cognitive biases have the property that I think they're easy to be aware of in the abstract, but difficult to ever feel them being applied in the moment. And so I think one example is the halo effect, like beautiful people or tall people or, various other things. We kind of perceive them as being maybe more intelligent or something. Like they have one good quality, and then we kind of attribute other good qualities to that person, even though there's no particular reason to think that they should. And I think this is something where, even though I know about this in the abstract, when I see it in person, I still every time just think like, oh no, this person must be good at these other things. So in those situations, how do you try to determine if the bias is applying right now versus just this could be a bias that applies in general?
Yeah, I think it can be really hard. I mean, one thing is that if you learn to pay close attention to your thoughts, which I was kind of mentioning earlier, I do think that can give you insights that you don't normally notice. Like if you're actually in the moment, paying attention to your perception, you might notice, oh, wow, I'm like really paying attention to how good looking this person is or something like that, right? And that could give you a clue. But also you can do kind of interesting thought experiments like, imagine that this like other person who's much less good looking said this thing. Would I feel differently about it? And I can just imagine it coming out of the other person's mouth and be like, oh yeah, actually that sounds like way less smart if that other person were to say that. So yeah, but yeah, it's really, really tricky.
Yeah. I struggle with this, especially I think like an equivalent version of it is in arguments, is when I'm, arguing with someone and I know intellectually that I'm wrong a lot of the time. But in any given moment, I feel like I'm probably right. Do you have like a tips for that situation, or how to balance that problem?
Right. I mean, the nature of belief, if you think of belief as a feeling, is that, well, you believe your beliefs, you think you're right about your beliefs. But we also know, taking an outside perspective, that we're definitely wrong about some of our beliefs, right? Some of our even strongly held beliefs we're definitely wrong about. So how do we square those two things? I like to think about this in two ways. One is like, insofar as you can, just like downgrade all your probabilities and your beliefs just a little bit, like is probably the correct adjustment. Just like just push them down a little bit. But then there's also contexts where I think we can have like an extra indicator that we might be wrong, even though like it's not about the like specific evidence or argument, because like we might be fully convinced by that, but there's certain sort of meta indicators that we might be wrong. And one of them is, if we have a very idiosyncratic belief, like we're the only person that believes this thing about this much thought on topic, we're like probably wrong about it, right? Take an example where like there's actually two large perspectives, and like for 100 years people have debated them, and you're on one side. Well, you know what? Like at least half the people are wrong about that topic, right? If you think about, oh wait, what's the chance I'm on like the right group between the two? And maybe both groups are wrong. So there might even be a third position that's right. So I'm like, probably a priori less than 50% likely to be true, be correct. Okay, maybe you don't want to give yourself that low a probability because maybe you think you're, convinced by the arguments, but you can downgrade your belief a little bit in that case.
That's great. In the chat, we have a question from Charles, which is, how do I get invited to these parties? And Ben says that is a great question. But Matthew has posted ergoevents.org in the chat. So if you're interested in these events, I would say they're more events than parties. Like you can visit the website, and that is the place to go. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I want to ask you one last quick question, and then I'm sure everyone here would love to hear where they can find you online, and how to keep hearing more about these ideas. So my last question is, why are rational people not more successful than they currently are? So I, obviously there is an assumption baked in here, but I feel like, given the power of the tools, I kind of could have imagined that rational people would be even more effective and successful. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I don't think there are any rational people, but there's some people that there are certainly individual differences. Some people are more rational than others, for sure. If you don't think that's true, then I think you haven't talked to enough people, because there's some people really irrational out there in the world. No, there's individual differences. The way that I look at it is that there are a lot of different skills you could have. Like, for example, social skills. Like, that has nothing to do with rationality, really. It might even be slightly negatively correlated in practice. And it's a really useful skill. It can help you do a lot of things in the world. Rationality is a different skill. And depending on what you're trying to do in the world, sometimes rationality won't help you very much. Like, if you're trying to be, a great dancer, I don't know that rationality is going to help you very much. However, there are other things you might be trying to do in the world where rationality is actually really, really important. Like, if you're trying to figure out an important truth about a highly politicized topic where everyone just yells at each other, like, that actually takes a lot of rationality to like cut through that and not get sucked into the one tribe or the other, or fall into the standard mistakes people make. So if you're trying to change the world in some really complex way where hundreds of others have tried and failed, and it really takes like a really thoughtful strategy to make that change, I think the rationality helps there too. So I think it's just about what you're trying to do. And like a bunch of standard notions of success are just not that related to rationality. And then some other really important things are, I think, more related to rationality.
That's great. Well, I know I would love to hear a lot more about this. Where can we find you and hear more of your ideas?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. And Uri, thank you so much for being the MC. So if you're interested in what I said today, definitely check out my podcast. Clearthinking.org has a lot of free tools. We've got like over 60 free tools you can try out. The podcast is called the Clearer Thinking Podcast. You check that out. We have over 100 episodes now. A lot of interesting thinkers have come on the podcast now. You can also check out our website, sparkwave.tech, if you're interested in sort of our other products and stuff we build.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you to our hosts, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Spencer.
Bye-bye. Thank you.